The thing is, if Britain didn't own India, who would have? India has never existed as a kind of unified country beforehand. Indian nationalism came as a reaction to British occupation. Before the British came in, you had like the Mughal Empire, which was like kind of Islamic, like invaders and stuff. India hadn't really been ruled by a native regime for many centuries. India was never united in that sense anyway. The north was always governed by differently from people in the south, and that's why you have linguistical differences, cultural differences, etc. We can't imagine that India itself would suddenly, without the British being there, would suddenly have kind of unified all by itself. India today would not exist without the British. However, with that being said, we do have to bear in mind that in the time when European powers were competing with each other, Britain was not the only player in that game. France would be the dominant colonial power. This is what we've said in the previous videos about what if the British Empire never existed. Definitely check those two out because there's a lot of overlap. All three of these videos kind of complement each other, which is why I've done them in such close succession. India would have been controlled by France because France already had possessions in India. You know, it already fought wars with the British in India, and actually, were it not for the battles of Wandiwash, was it Wandiwash? Wandiwop? Can't remember now. So that battle and the Battle of Plassey. So the Battle of Plassey, that was the really like dominant one, right? And also easier to pronounce. Those two battles were really decisive. The fact that in the 7 Years' War, which Churchill later referred to as the First World War, because it was a world-spanning conflict. In those two battles, the British, although they were vastly outnumbered by the French and their allies, they were still able to defeat them. These two battles have gone differently. If the French had been able to kick the British out of India in the same way that the British managed to kick most of the French out, how can we imagine India being governed differently? French colonies compared to British colonies. How were they run? What was the kind of overarching thing? Not all colonialism is exactly the same. It differs from power to power. So how were French colonies governed differently from British ones? The mindset of the French Empire was a lot more of a so-called civilizing mission. So the idea of their empire was basically these colonies are going to be turned into France. They're going to have French roads, French buildings, French culture. They're all going to be speaking French. The goal of our thing is that in spite of race, in spite of religion, etc., the idea is that all people within the French Empire are going to be turned into good Frenchmen. The idea of the British Empire was very much more, we don't really care how the locals govern themselves, as long as they don't have any kind of practices such as slavery, as long as they don't have practices such as they had in India, sati. So in India, if a husband died, it used to be practiced to throw the widow onto the funeral pyre, and the British banned that. There's a famous case where the Indians said, no, you can't do this here, this is our culture, this is our tradition here. And the British colonial officer who was in charge, he said the very famous lines of, in my country it's tradition that if a man kills a woman, he should be hanged, so you stick to your traditions and we'll stick to ours. And that's how the practice of sati got put an end to. The British pretty much, they had certain red lines, certain moral red lines which they weren't going to negotiate with as such, right? But beyond that, they didn't really care how the natives governed themselves. Often the British ruled through local rulers and basically kept much of the same levels of taxation, the same regulatory processes. The only thing that the British were really concerned about was British companies being able to operate freely in those places and to extract resources and materials from these colonies to the mother country. And that was pretty much, that's how the British kind of run it. They just wanted railways, they just want to cut the bureaucracy, they want to cut out the middleman, they just wanted ease for their companies to be able to operate freely in those places. So that's obviously very different. So if you think about the main financial hubs in kind of South Asia and Southeast Asia today, we think Hong Kong, Kuala Lumpur, Singapore, Mumbai, which used to be Bombay, Kolkata, which used to be Kolkata in Calcutta is spelt differently, but the same thing, and Madras, which is now called Chennai, right? All those colonies, all those cities used to be part of the British Empire. The British basically encourage a lot of trade. They encourage places to be financial and trading hubs. We think about Saigon, which is now Ho Chi Minh. Yeah, that was obviously in French Indochina, which is modern day Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia. If you compare Hong Kong to Saigon, now Ho Chi Minh city has caught up and become that kind of financial hub. But it still doesn't even pale in comparison to what Hong Kong is, nor Singapore. In both of these kind of places, it's a thing where the legacy of the British Empire is a lot more entrepreneurial, it's a lot more kind of business orientated, whereas the French is a lot more bureaucratic, and it's focused a lot more on kind of like governorship rather than on just entrepreneurialism. The perfect example of this actually is within India itself, because the British didn't kick India out everywhere, but the French were still out. What did I just say? Did I say the British didn't kick the British out everywhere? Can't remember. I have to check this back. If I've made a mistake, I've made a mistake. If I've made a mistake by thinking I've made a mistake, then that's stupid. But anyway, the French were still in Pondicherry. If we compare Pondicherry to Mumbai or to Kolkata or to Madras, it doesn't even pale in comparison. It still is relatively poor. It doesn't have that much of a big like GDP, whereas Mumbai, i.e. Bombay, makes up, I think, something crazy like 6% of India's GDP. Like it's absolutely like, it's a booming town. Where the French went, it didn't really spur industrial growth. It didn't like kind of spur innovation or trade or commerce or anything, right? They kind of just ran it, right? And that was kind of just it. India today wouldn't be as dynamic as it is today. With French being the lingua franca there instead of English, it would have had a lot less business ties, although obviously would have had quite a strong connection to France. But India today, I don't know, like kind of, in some ways it would have been better, in some ways it would have been worse.